What would drive a wild stallion to leap off a 50-foot cliff, certain death below predators closing in? And how did that impossible choice spark a revolution in the natural world? Long before the world would know his name, Nightfire was already a legend written into the soil of Wyoming's wildest terrain. Among the jagged stone ridges and sweeping grass valleys of the Wind River Range, he moved not like a creature born of this earth, but like something ancient and eternal, a whisper of thunder in the mountains, the flash of lightning in the dark. He was born during a brutal winter, the kind that claimed the lives of both prey and predator alike. His mother, a resilient mare named Solace, gave birth to him under a pine thicket beside a frozen stream. He stood earlier than most foals, his first breath steaming in the cold air, eyes wide, not with fear, but awareness. He observed before he moved even then. As he grew, the herd came to follow his lead long before he took the mantle of leadership. At just 4 years old, he challenged and displaced an aging stallion who had grown reckless with age and complacent in his instincts. Nightfire was different. His decisions weren't driven by impulse or dominance, but by calculation. He didn't command with force, he led with vision. By the time Laura Bennett first found him, he was 9 years old and already leading a band of 6 mares and 3 foals. She wasn't searching for him. Specifically, she had been conducting a long-form study on wild Mustangs across the region. But the moment she saw him, her project shifted. Laura had spent years chasing the wind with her camera, following herds across the open West in a quest that blended science with something more personal, a longing to understand freedom in its purest form. She had seen thousands of wild horses, each with their own dignity and resilience, but nothing like this stallion. Nightfire wasn't just surviving, he was shaping the land around him. It wasn't just his presence, the midnight coat that shimmered under sun, and stormed the long mane that flowed like shadow, the deep-set eyes that seemed to read the landscape. It was his awareness. His decisions appeared rooted not in instinct, but in perception. Laura couldn't explain it at first. She simply watched. Her field notes from that spring were full of unanswered questions. Why did he lead his herd so close to the cliffs? Why did he guide the foals to look over the waterfall's edge? Why did he choose paths that no other stallion dared? She documented everything: his posture during storms, the way he waited before crossing a creek, how he positioned himself between the herd and unseen dangers. There was one particular morning that stayed with her. The herd had grazed peacefully in a high meadow near Emerald Drop Falls, a towering 50-foot waterfall that carved its name into the cliffs like a warning. Most animals avoided it instinctively, but not Nightfire. He approached the precipice with the quiet gravity of a sentinel. The wind carried mist across his coat as he stood at the edge unmoving. The foals at a distance mimicked his stillness. Laura watched through her lens, heart in her throat, as the stallion tilted his head, not downward in fear, but outward as if measuring the space below. It was not curiosity, it was comprehension. That day she made her decision. Nightfire wouldn't just be a subject of observation. He would be the core of her next body of work, a long-term behavioral study to challenge prevailing assumptions about wild equine cognition. She applied for grants, collaborated with field biologists, and even reached out to specialists in animal neuroscience. Her colleagues were skeptical at first. Horses weren't known for their intelligence in the same ways as primates, cetaceans, or corvids. Most equine research focused on domesticated behavior training responses, social hierarchy, herd dynamics. Few had seriously considered the wild Mustang as a subject of cognitive study, but Laura was convinced. She wasn't trying to prove horses were human-like. She was trying to prove that they were more than what we had assumed. Nightfire made that argument for her. Over months, Laura recorded dozens of behavioral sequences that defied traditional understanding. Nightfire routinely moved his herd away from approaching weather systems hours before they arrived, long before any observable signs presented themselves. He altered travel routes depending on recent predator activity, once even leading his group into a ravine and holding them there overnight while a pack of mountain lions passed nearby. More than once, she saw him stop mid-route, turning back entirely when a ridge felt too unstable. And each time the herd followed, not out of fear, but out of trust. The foals learned quickly. They mimicked his pauses, mirrored his body language. The mares maintained formation around them in tight, deliberate groups as if rehearsed. Laura once watched a young foal stumble near a ledge. Before any horse could react, Nightfire spun, placed himself between the foal and the drop, and stood unmoving until the youngster regained footing. It was that level of awareness of space, of responsibility, of risk, that convinced Laura of something extraordinary. Nightfire wasn't reacting to the world. He was managing it. The herd's interactions with him were unlike anything she had documented before. They didn't just follow, they deferred. Read his signals, position themselves accordingly. There were moments that looked like choreography, but no one had written the dance. In one remarkable instance, she watched Nightfire stop during a migration through a low valley. He sniffed the air, moved to a nearby tree, and scraped at the bark. Moments later, a storm rolled in. When other herds were caught in the deluge, Nightfire's band had already moved to higher ground. It was not luck. It was pattern recognition. It was wisdom. The environment around Emerald Drop Falls was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Yet Nightfire had carved a life within it that wasn't just functional, it was flourishing. His foals thrived. His mares remained together. There was almost no sign of intra-herd aggression. Even the wolves stayed distant. Timberwood Pack, a known predator force in the region, had shadowed herds before thinning out the weak, the slow. But Nightfire's group had remained untouched. Until, of course, everything changed. As spring turned to early summer, signs of the pack began to appear near the cliffs. Tracks in the mud, a carcass stripped clean, eyes in the shadows at dusk. Laura knew something was building. The animals did too. She saw it in the way Nightfire's pauses grew longer, how the mares tightened their formation around the foals, how the herd seemed to sleep lighter, rise earlier, move faster. Tension threaded the valley like wire. The weather turned erratic. The grass grew thick and sweet but uneaten. Nightfire would guide his herd to a pasture only to turn them away after a single bite. It was as if he sensed what others couldn't, a shift in the balance of the land. And on a still morning when the sun rose behind the cliffs like fire and the air hung with silence, the ambush came. But that is another part of the story. What mattered first was this: a stallion named Nightfire stood as more than a leader of horses. He was the mind of the wild given form. He was instinct elevated to strategy. He was strength tempered by foresight. And in the days to come, he would defy everything the world thought it knew about what a horse could do. It began in silence. Not the stillness of peace, but the kind of silence that presses against the skin, too quiet to trust. The sun had just begun to rise over the Wind River Range, casting pale amber light across the rugged terrain, when Laura Bennett set her camera on its tripod and looked through the viewfinder. Below her, in the long, shadowed folds near Emerald Drop Falls, Nightfire's herd grazed on dew-drenched grass, their dark forms barely stirring in the golden morning hush. From her vantage point high on the rocky ridge, Laura watched the movements of the herd closely. She had tracked them for weeks, her tent pitched near the edge of the cliffs, so she could follow them without disturbing their rhythms. Nightfire was particularly alert that morning, more so than usual. His movements were slower, more deliberate. He stood slightly apart from the others, head raised, eyes fixed to the north. The foals were restless. The mares, usually spread out in a relaxed arc around the youngsters, had bunched tighter. Nightfire had already positioned himself along the outer edge of the group, his powerful frame, tense ears twitching back and forth. Laura adjusted her lens. She'd learned by now to trust Nightfire's instincts even before her own. If he sensed something, it wasn't imagination. Then she saw them. At first, just a blur of movement behind the brush, then a distinct shadow between the trees. Wolves. Not a lone scout or a wandering pair. This was a full pack. The Timberwood Pack. 8 strong, synchronized, relentless. Led by the infamous alpha male known by researchers as Scathe, a battle-worn gray wolf with a torn ear and a scar that cut across the bridge of his muzzle like a lightning bolt. Scathe was known not only for his aggression, but for his intelligence. Over the past several years, he had earned a reputation among wildlife trackers for orchestrating precision hunts that played out like chess matches. Today, his target was Nightfire. Laura's heart began to hammer. She whispered into her recorder, her voice barely audible over the wind. The pack's in formation. They're moving in with purpose. This isn't random. It wasn't. The wolves had waited patiently for days. They had shadowed the herd from afar, studying their paths, their watering patterns, their grazing spots. And now as the horses approached the narrow trail leading toward the cliffside spring near Emerald Drop, the wolves made their move. They separated 4, taking the higher ground, circling downwind, while 3 crept along the lower path, herding the horses without ever touching them. The mares reacted first, their instincts kicking in. They called the foals close hooves, stamping the earth as they pulled away from the direction of the encroaching shadows. Nightfire responded instantly, positioning himself between the herd and the threat. But what he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that this wasn't a direct assault. It was a trap. Scathe and his wolves weren't chasing the herd. They were isolating its heart. Nightfire. With terrifying precision, the wolves began to split the group. One flank moved to block the retreat path, while the others pushed Nightfire toward the narrowest part of the trail, a ledge barely 5 feet wide that overlooked the waterfall's thunderous descent. From her ridge, Laura could see it all. Her fingers tightened around the camera, snapping images, even as her mind screamed at her to do something, anything. But there was no reaching them, no path down in time. This was nature unfolding on its own terms, merciless and breathtaking. Nightfire did not panic. He backed away slowly, hooves steady even as gravel crumbled beneath him. His eyes scanned the ridge, not wild with fear, but sharp with calculation. The roar of the waterfall behind him grew louder, the mist spraying across his flanks. The wolves advanced. They moved in low and fast, darting with practiced rhythm, never giving him a clear target, always forcing him to retreat step by step. Scathe led the charge, now eyes locked with Nightfire's. It was a duel beyond sound, primal and ancient, predator and prey. But more than that, 2 leaders, each reading the other, each daring the other to make the next move. Nightfire struck out with his front hooves, lashing the air with the force of a hammer. Scathe danced back unharmed. The stallion wheeled and kicked, nearly catching another wolf mid-leap. Still, the pack kept pressing forward. Then it happened. Nightfire's rear hoof slipped just slightly over the ledge. The ground beneath him gave way in a dusting of loose rock and soil. He recovered instantly, but Laura felt the moment like a crack in her chest. He was running out of space. The herd watched helplessly from the ridge above, huddled together in silent desperation. The foals cried out, the mares stomped in distress, but no one moved forward. No one could reach him. The wolves began to close the semicircle, leaving the only route of escape to be backward into the sky. And then in that stillness, Nightfire stopped moving. He stood framed by the dawn in the mist, his body trembling, not from fear but from focus. Laura could see the moment he made the decision. His head turned just slightly, looking not at the wolves, but at the chasm behind him. He assessed the drop, the rocks, the angle, the pool far below. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't madness. It was mathematics. Scathe, sensing hesitation, lunged again. This time he aimed for Nightfire's foreleg, a savage strike designed not to kill, but to cripple. Nightfire rose up in defiance, a rearing black silhouette against the roaring white cascade. And then he leapt. Laura gasped. Her hands fell from the camera. Time froze. Nightfire exploded forward with 3 powerful strides, and then with impossible grace launched himself into the air. He did not tumble. He did not flail. He flew. For one impossible second, he was suspended in space, a creature carved from darkness and light soaring against the dawn. The wolves halted, stunned. Even Scathe's eyes followed the arc of the stallion's body. Laura fumbled her camera back to her eye just in time to capture the impact, a massive burst of white water that swallowed Nightfire whole as he hit the pool below. And then silence. No movement, no sound but the pounding of the falls. From above, the herd called out. From the cliffs, the wolves began to scatter, some lingering, some retreating down the trail, unsure whether their plan had succeeded or failed. Laura's breath came in shallow bursts. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She stared at the churning water below, willing it to reveal something, anything. Had she just witnessed a miracle or a tragedy beyond words? She kept her camera trained on the surface of the pool every second, stretching into eternity. She did not dare blink, because deep inside she knew something. Nightfire hadn't jumped in panic. He hadn't jumped to die. He had chosen to fly. And if he had made that choice, then somewhere down there beneath the foam and fury, a black stallion still lived. The wolves had laid a perfect trap, but Nightfire had written a new rule. And in that moment, hanging in the balance between survival and legend, he had become something more than a horse. He had become the embodiment of wild freedom, the living spirit of a land that refuses to be tamed. The pool at the base of Emerald Drop Falls was a violent place. It churned in relentless circles, fed by the force of water plunging 50 feet from above. Jagged rocks framed its edges, and the current underneath was stronger than it appeared, known among local rangers for pulling down fallen elk and trapping them beneath its spinning vortex. In all of Laura Bennett's years tracking wild animals, she had never seen anything survive such a fall. And yet now her heart clung to the impossible idea that somewhere beneath that exploding veil of water, Nightfire was still alive. From the ledge above, everything had gone still. The Timberwood wolves had pulled back from the edge, pacing restlessly disoriented. They had executed their plan flawlessly. They had cornered the most cunning stallion in the region, funneled him to the one place where no prey could possibly escape. And yet when Nightfire leapt, it had unraveled their strategy in a single act of defiance. He had not fallen like prey. He had flown like something wild and ungovernable. Laura's hands trembled as she kept her lens fixed on the pool below. Seconds dragged into unbearable stretches of time. The surface of the water calmed just slightly, settling into a glassy sheen, broken only by the ever-pounding waterfall. No movement, no ripples, just a void where a living legend had vanished. She whispered to herself without realizing it, "Please, I'll come back." And then just as hope threatened to collapse under the weight of silence, the water broke open. First a plume of spray, then a glistening black muzzle emerged, followed by the flash of a wet mane, then the full rise of Nightfire's head above the surface. He gasped, nostrils flared, wide ears pinned back. Water streamed from his face as he drew a ragged breath and began to move. He was alive. Laura's heart surged with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The stallion was not thrashing or struggling, as most horses did when dropped into deep water. There was a clarity in his motion, each movement of his legs deliberate, purposeful. He angled his body against the current, pushing through the roiling surface like a creature born to swim, even though horses, especially wild ones, were not made for this. The Timberwood pack, gathered along the ridge above, let out a collective growl. Some of them began descending the slope toward the base of the falls. They still believed they could win. If Nightfire emerged dazed or wounded, he would be vulnerable. An exhausted animal dragged ashore by instinct alone could be finished in seconds. The hunt wasn't over in their minds, it was merely moving to the next phase. But Nightfire had other ideas. He saw them too. His head turned toward the descending trail, registering the wolves even as they began to flank the nearest bank. Then he made a critical choice one few predators would have anticipated. He didn't swim toward the closest exit. He turned instead and struck out for the opposite shore, a far steeper rock-laced side that offered no easy footing, but a crucial advantage: it was out of reach from the wolves' descent path. The current fought him every inch of the way. Laura could see his body dip and rise with the strength of the flow. His legs moved in wide, steady arcs, not panicked, but strained with exertion. Halfway across the pool, he hit the center vortex, the place where the waterfall's impact created the strongest resistance. For a terrifying moment, his body stalled, pulled backward by the undertow. His head dipped below the surface. His hindquarters twisted with the force of the current. Laura pressed the shutter instinctively, capturing frame after frame, afraid it might be the last. Then Nightfire reappeared. With a roar not from his mouth but from the force of his will, he kicked forward again, finding the rhythm, adapting the movement. He wasn't swimming like a domestic horse might, thrashing, chaotic, desperate. He was calculating each motion, angling against the current, treating it as another obstacle to solve. As he neared the rocky edge, Laura saw one of the wolves reach the far shoreline. It paused, staring across the pool, uncertain. The water was too deep, the current too strong. The wolves were quick and clever, but they were not swimmers. Not like this. Nightfire's hooves touched bottom just as the first predator howled. He surged forward, dragging his heavy body out of the river, water sheeting off him like rain from stone. His flanks heaved and his muscles shuddered from the effort, but his legs remained steady. He stood. His body glistened in the rising sun, steam rising from his soaked coat. Against the backdrop of cliffs and mist, he looked like a god risen from the depths. Across the water, the wolves howled in frustration. They paced, snarled, barked. None dared enter the water. Their strategy had failed and they knew it. They had gambled everything on the idea that no horse would ever leap to certain death, and they had underestimated the stallion who had refused to play by any known rule. Laura exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Her face was wet, though she didn't know whether from mist or tears. Her voice shook as she spoke into her recorder. Nightfire has survived. He chose the water. He fought the current. He outthought them. What she didn't say, but what she now knew with certainty, was that she had witnessed a moment that would change everything. But Nightfire was not done yet. His journey wasn't over. From his new vantage point on the opposite bank, he looked up at the cliffs where his herd still waited. Their calls echoed across the canyon, high-pitched and urgent. He answered with a deep, resonant sound that rolled across the stone like thunder. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a statement, "I am alive. I am returning." He began to move along the shoreline, not fleeing but mapping. Every few yards, he paused to scan the slope above him. The wolves tracked his movements from the other side, occasionally disappearing into the trees, possibly circling in an attempt to intercept him. But Nightfire chose his path with deliberate caution. Where the forest thickened, he skirted it. Where the canyon wall sloped upward, he tested the terrain with careful steps before proceeding. Laura tracked him for over an hour. He never once faltered. The exhaustion showed in the droop of his shoulders and the slower gait, but not once did he stumble or give in to fatigue. Every decision was calculated, every step drawn from an internal map forged through years of survival and leadership. When he finally crested a slope that gave him sight of his herd, the reaction was instant. The mares surged forward. The foals squealed. Nightfire remained still as they approached, allowing them to come to him. One by one, they greeted him, muzzles, touching bodies, pressing against his, in a silent celebration of reunion. Laura, watching from afar, felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just relief, it was reverence. Despite his ordeal, Nightfire resumed his role as if nothing had changed. He checked each member of the herd, circled them slowly, then led them away from the cliffs at a calm, steady pace. It was as though he had never been gone, as though the impossible had not just happened. But for Laura, and soon for the world, what had just transpired would become a new legend of the wild. Back in her camp that evening, Laura downloaded her photographs and reviewed them frame by frame. The leap, the mid-air form, the impact, the resurfacing, the swim, the climb. It was all there, not a fable, not an exaggeration, but proof. The images told a story of courage, intelligence, and adaptability far beyond what most believed possible for a wild horse. And beneath those visual records was a truth she felt deep in her bones, that Nightfire had made a decision not just to survive, but to outwit, to lead not just with muscle, but with mind. Nightfire had stared into the face of death and chosen something greater. Not escape, but transcendence. The morning air in the Wind River Range felt different now, years after the leap. The sun still lit the canyon walls with the same golden fire, and the cry of eagles still echoed across the granite cliffs. But something fundamental had shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The land itself had borne witness to what happened at Emerald Drop Falls, and in the quiet breath between seasons, it whispered the story to those willing to listen. Nightfire had not only survived that day, he had rewritten something deep within the wilderness. It began quietly, as most revolutions do, not with a roar, but with a question. How had he done it? How had a wild horse, a prey animal, not only survived an ambush, but outsmarted a pack of wolves using terrain, water, and time? And perhaps the more astonishing question, had he known even before the moment came what he was willing to do? Laura Bennett had asked herself these questions 1,000 times as she reviewed the photos, the footage, and the field notes she'd collected during that season. She hadn't just captured an incredible moment of survival. She had captured a decision, a strategy, and ultimately a glimpse into a level of awareness that science had long dismissed in animals like Nightfire. And her documentation didn't sit quietly in her archive, it rippled outward. When she published her first academic paper in Visual Journal, the response was polarized. Some praised the detail, the emotion, the rare insight. Others, particularly among traditional animal behaviorists, raised objections. Horses, they argued, did not make decisions based on abstract reasoning. Their behavior was instinctive, rooted in flight, not in strategy. But then came the second layer of evidence. Within months, Laura returned to the cliffs to observe Nightfire's herd, unsure whether the stallion would still be alive. What she found changed everything. Not only had he survived, he had thrived. The herd had grown, 6 mares had become 9, and foals from previous years had matured now, guiding their own younger siblings. But what struck her most was not the numbers, it was the behavior. One spring morning, while Laura watched from a hidden bluff, a young mare named Whisperleaf found herself separated from the herd. A flash flood had forced a division, and she stood at the edge of a smaller 10-foot waterfall, uncertain and alone. What happened next made Laura drop her pen. Whisperleaf studied the water below. She backed up, then approached again. She turned her head sideways to examine the flow. Then, in an act that mirrored the stallion who had raised her, she leapt, controlled, purposeful, and landed safely in the pool beneath. She swam with measured strokes to rejoin the others on the far side. There had been no panic in her eyes, only calculation. It wasn't an isolated event. Over the following months, Laura recorded a growing number of interactions where the herd demonstrated what could only be called learned behavior. The foals too young to witness Nightfire's leap firsthand mimicked his caution when approaching rivers. They followed his lead during crossings, maintaining a formation that placed the strongest mares on the outer edges and the youngest in the center. It was a mobile barrier, a strategy Laura had only seen in coordinated predator evasion among certain marine mammals. Even more compelling were the moments of what Laura began to call deliberate environmental assessment. At least 3 times she watched as Nightfire led his herd to the very edge of Emerald Drop, not in peril, but as if to study. He would stand there, gaze down, and allow the foals to observe. Once he even returned with the entire group and positioned them behind him while he paced along the ledge. It looked for all the world like he was teaching. These observations could no longer be ignored. Dr. Elaine Morgan, a behavioral ecologist initially skeptical of Laura's work, visited the site herself. Within weeks, she became one of Nightfire's most vocal defenders. What we are seeing, she wrote in her later publication, is not just adaptation, it is cognition. It is the formation of cultural memory within a wild herd. Nightfire's decision to leap had sparked something far greater than survival. It had initiated a shift in how wild horses responded to threats, to obstacles, and to each other. His legacy was not just his life, but the intelligence he passed down. As this new understanding gained traction, policies around wild horse management began to evolve. For decades, herds had been confined by human-determined boundaries. Natural barriers like rivers, cliffs, and steep canyons were considered sufficient to contain populations. But Nightfire's leap forced a reevaluation. If a stallion could not only overcome such a boundary but teach his herd to navigate it, then those boundaries no longer held. New conservation initiatives emerged, placing an emphasis on allowing herds to engage with challenging terrain rather than avoiding it. Resource access, once thought too dangerous or distant, became reachable with strategic observation. Herds learned from one another. Rangers began documenting behavioral patterns, spreading from Nightfire's group to nearby herds through what could only be interpreted as social diffusion, an exchange of survival knowledge across group lines. Nightfire's story also moved beyond the scientific community. Laura published her full account in a book titled Hoofprints in the Sky, blending narrative storytelling with hard data, stunning imagery, and field notes. It became a quiet sensation among nature enthusiasts, educators, and even military strategy analysts who studied the stallion's ability to respond under pressure with adaptable decision-making. She was invited to speak at conferences, schools, and conservation forums. In every presentation, she showed one photo: Nightfire suspended midair in front of the waterfall body, extended like a shadow against the morning light. It became a symbol of untamed choice, of nature's untapped brilliance. 5 years after the leap, Laura returned once more to the granite cliffs. Nightfire was 13 now, an age at which many wild stallions begin to fade. But when she found him, it was clear that the fire in him had not dimmed. His coat was still dark as coal, though the beginnings of silver traced his muzzle. His movement was slower perhaps, but every step still carried the weight of leadership. The herd had changed again now, numbering 17. Laura noticed several offspring of the original mares had grown into sleek, strong adults. The group had established a territory that extended on both sides of the river, crossing it with ease when migrating between the seasonal grazing grounds. And they crossed with coordination. One morning, Laura set up near a known river crossing. The sky was clear and the water level was low. She waited, camera ready, As if choreographed, Nightfire led his herd to the bank. He paused, scanning the flow, then turned upstream and walked along the edge. Two elder mares followed, positioning themselves downstream as if creating a physical buffer. Once he reached a favorable spot, he entered the water, and the others followed in a formation that placed the youngest foals in the center, protected by the bodies of the adults. The image was stunning. It wasn't luck or guesswork, it was strategy. These wild horses were not just reacting to their environment, they were mastering it. Laura later described the moment in her journal. He has given them more than safety. He has given them a system, a way to survive, a way to think, a way to pass on knowledge that goes beyond instinct. There were other signs that the ripple of Nightfire's leap had extended farther than anyone could have imagined. Nearby herds began using similar crossing patterns. Lone stallions, once known for rash movements, now showed signs of cooperative leadership. Even predator behavior shifted. Wolf packs avoided areas near the rivers during migration season, having learned that the herds there were no longer easy targets. In time, Nightfire returned to the edge of the very cliff where his legend was born. Laura happened to be there, watching from a familiar ridge. She didn't raise her camera right away. She simply watched. He stood alone, gazing down into the depths, not with fear or regret, but with something almost like reverence. Perhaps she thought he remembered. Perhaps he understood that what he had done was more than a survival tactic. It was a moment that split time in two. She finally took one photograph. It would be her last of him. In it, Nightfire stands still, the wind catching the strands of his silvered mane, his body framed by the same sky into which he had once leapt. Behind him, the canyon stretches wide and timeless. Beneath him, the water still roars. Somewhere between those two elements, sky and stone, past and future, a stallion had made a choice that echoed across generations. Nightfire did not just leap to save himself, he leapt to lead. And in doing so, he became more than a horse. He became a legacy, a living truth that nature is still teaching, still learning, and still capable of rewriting its own laws when the moment demands it. Nightfire's story is not simply the tale of a wild stallion. It is a living metaphor, an emblem of courage, intellect, and the undying will to lead with purpose. From the jagged ridgelines of Wyoming's Wind River Range to the roaring heart of Emerald Drop Falls, Nightfire's journey unfolded not with fanfare, but with fierce silence and unshakable instinct. He did not follow the script written by nature for prey animals. Instead, he authored his own, a story of choice in the face of certainty, of wisdom, where instinct alone would have failed. He was a stallion born into hardship, matured through challenge, and defined by a single extraordinary moment, the leap. In that impossible instant when death encircled him and survival seemed unreachable, Nightfire chose to leap into the unknown rather than succumb to the inevitable. And in doing so, he not only saved his life, he rewrote the understanding of what it meant to survive, to lead, and to pass on knowledge in the wild. But the leap was only the beginning. Nightfire's true legacy lived on in how he returned scarred but unbroken to his herd, how he resumed his role not with spectacle, but with quiet certainty, how he began to teach not through noise, but through example. Under his leadership, his herd didn't merely survive, it evolved. Foals learned to assess danger. Mares learned to coordinate protection. The herd became a community of learners, thinking, adapting, thriving. More remarkable still, Nightfire's choices sparked a ripple across the natural world. His descendants, and even herds beyond his own, began to show patterns of behavior once thought impossible in wild equines: strategic thinking, cultural transmission, collaborative adaptation. Scientists were forced to rethink long-held assumptions. Conservationists began to revise how they approached the protection of wild horses, all because of one moment, one leap, one stallion. And what about us? What lesson can we draw from a creature who faced death not with fear, but with vision? The truth is, we all stand at the edge of our own cliffs, moments of change, crisis, or overwhelming fear. We often believe we are bound by the limits around us, by fear, by circumstances, by what the world tells us we can and cannot do. But Nightfire reminds us that when instinct says run and the world says surrender, there's a third path: leap. Make the hard choice. Trust the knowledge you've earned. Face your fears with strategy, not panic. And more than anything, lead not by command, but by example. Whether it's your family, your team, or your community, those who follow you will learn more from your actions than your words. So let Nightfire be more than just a stallion in a story. Let him be a symbol, a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. That leadership is quiet, consistent, and intentional. That even in the wilderness, wisdom can thrive. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think, feel, or see the world just a little differently, please subscribe to the channel and help us continue sharing these powerful real-life stories. Your support helps us bring more stories of nature's courage and intelligence to light. Let's leap together into the next adventure.